What's up, my fellow adult collectors, and welcome to Surveying Collectibles. With WWE WrestleMania 39 on the horizon, and only a few days away by the time this video gets posted, it got me to thinking about its history, its legacy, my experience with it all, how long I've been watching, what all I've watched, what I've liked, what I've disliked, all that stuff. Not necessarily just with WrestleMania though. Instead, my overall history and experience with the brand as a whole. Watching the shows, collecting the action figures, getting the trading cards, reading the comic books, playing the video games, everything encompassing the brand. When I first started to conceptualize ideas for this particular video, I thought I was going to talk about my experience with the wrestling industry as a whole and include brands such as Ring of Honor, AEW, and Impact Wrestling. But when I started to see just how long this video was going to end up being, I decided to reduce it down to just what's currently under the WWE umbrella. If this is your first time on my channel, hi, my name is Seville, and here I'd like to discuss action figures and other collectibles based on my favorite movies, TV shows, and video games. If you find this video enjoyable or informative, please give me a thumbs up, don't forget to subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Of course, since I was born in 1983, my personal history with professional wrestling starts in the 1980s. For the World Wrestling Federation's golden era, I can't say there's any specific match or show that I remember being the first that I watched. It was just kind of always there because my dad was watching before I was born. Dad was one of those who definitely always pronounced it as wrestling. Even beyond remembering what might be the first match I ever watched, I don't necessarily remember a lot of matches at all from the 80s, with the exception of the big ones like Hogan and Mr. T teaming up at the first WrestleMania, or Hogan and Andre at WrestleMania 3. However, I do remember certain characters standing out to me a lot and always being really happy to see them, like Hulk Hogan, Macho Man, and Roddy Piper. My absolute favorite story in the 80s was when Hulk Hogan and Macho Man teamed up together as the Mega Powers. Back then, this really felt like the wrestling version of Superman and Batman teaming together. There were other characters that I liked too, such as Jimmy Snuka, Junkyard Dog, and Sergeant Slaughter. I thought it was really cool that Sergeant Slaughter was also in the G.I. Joe cartoon. Plus, I do remember watching the Hogan's Rock and Wrestling cartoon some too. My older brother and I shared a set of the LJN big rubber figures as well as a ring that we'd play with together quite often back then. As the 80s came to a close though, a few other characters did start to stand out to me, such as Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase, and Jake the Snake Roberts. As the 90s started to roll in and the WWF's new era began, a lot of new faces started to appear, and tag team wrestling became a lot more prominent. The Rockers, Steiners, Hart Foundation, Head Shrinkers, Legion of Doom, Demolition, but the ones that really stood out to me were the Natural Disasters, Typhoon, and Earthquake, because they both looked almost exactly like my dad. Well, to be more clear, my dad looked more like Earthquake because they were both bald on top of their head, but still, my dad was a big, burly guy like these two. Back on the singles side, though, I remember being really mad as a kid when Ultimate Warrior defeated Hulk Hogan. Like, I liked Ultimate Warrior, but how dare he? I was still pretty hung up on my favorites like Hogan and Macho Man. I didn't mind the new faces coming in like Dusty, Flair, Mr. Perfect, Boss Man, or Lex Luger, but I didn't want them taking over the number one spot. However, as the new characters became pushed more and more, The Undertaker and Yokozuna became my two favorites. I was also pretty thoroughly impressed by the likes of Razor Ramon, Diesel, and the 1-2-3 Kid. By this point, I was fully invested in the brand, collecting as many of the action figures as I could, as well as the trading cards. Unfortunately, during the mid-90s, my family went through a bit of a financial hardship and lost access to satellite or cable, so I wasn't able to watch anything for a while. The last story I can remember seeing before this happened was the Undertaker vs. Undertaker story. So, if you can remember the roster of characters that were in the WrestleMania arcade game, that's pretty much the characters I remember seeing towards the end of that run. Before that point, though, I had heard of WCW, but never really went and watched it regularly. Like, I remember playing the old NES game with a buddy, but I didn't know who any of the characters were. And then I remember occasionally flipping channels and seeing the WCW Saturday Night or something, but never stayed around on it, never tried to watch it consistently. Then, when it was all over the news that Hulk Hogan had decided to jump over to WCW, my high school best friend was also a wrestling fan, and he would kind of tell me what was going on here and there. I remember a lot of it sounding redundant and just more of the same, but then I'll never forget the day he told me that Hogan had turned bad and joined the Outsiders. With the formation of the New World Order, I was getting more and more hooked without even being able to actually watch it. As the number of NWO members grew and grew, and I began to put together that it was mostly former WWF characters, I became more and more interested. Around this time, my family finally got satellite access back, so the very first episode of WCW that I actually watched in its entirety from home was the final Clash of Champions. This was the first time I really paid attention to a lot of WCW characters such as DDP, Sting, the Four Horsemen, and Raven's Flock. At this time, to me, the whole WCW versus NWO story was very compelling, and I was very much on the side of the NWO. In fact, the very first wrestling t-shirt I ever bought was an NWO shirt, and that led me to start wearing all black, which has carried forward through most of my adult life. By 1998, I was fully invested in all of the WCW programming, and when they debuted Thunder, I thought the logo choice was interesting because it looked very familiar. For the DC fans out there, did you notice that they actually used the same font style that the Electric Superman used? Anyway, back to the New World Order. Is it weird to know that while I was reading every single Superman comic that I could possibly get my hands on, I was also cheering for the NWO? And I don't mean the Wolfpack. When they split between NWO Hollywood wearing the white and black and the Wolfpack wearing red and black, I was still wearing the white and black. I was very much the outcast of the outcast in my high school because every other wrestling fan was wearing a Wolfpack shirt while I was still wearing the Hollywood shirt. Even our homecoming theme that year was centered around the Wolfpack. Beyond that, while newer characters were starting to gain prominence, such as the Luchadors banding together to form the LWO, and then of course Goldberg coming in with the undefeated streak and it quickly becoming the face of WCW, I was still very much attached to the characters I grew up with, like Hogan and Macho Man. By this point, I was fully invested in the brand, had to have the ring play set, all the action figures I could find, all the trading cards I could get, and especially the Nintendo 64 video game, WCW NWO Revenge. I cannot tell you the amount of hours I must have logged into that game. Then came the night of January 4th, 1999. For those of you who may not know your wrestling history, this is the night of the WCW Finger Poke of Doom between Hogan and Nash, and the night that Mick Foley wins the WWF title for the first time. At this point, WWF was filming 2 episodes of Raw per week, so every other episode was pre-taped and WCW would know the results of by the time they went live. So WCW's producers had gotten into the habit of making the announcers tell you the results of WWF to try and encourage you not to watch it. Pretty much immediately, though, almost 400,000 fans switched to WWF to watch Foley win that championship, while the rest of us who stayed on WCW watched one of the worst decisions they ever made. Instead of a great World Heavyweight Championship match between the two characters who had been feuding for a year between NWO Hollywood and NWO Wolfpack, Nash just took the poke, laid down, and handed the title to Hogan. So, I've got to give a little personal context here now. By this point, Dad had gotten us a big screen TV that had picture-in-picture capabilities. So, when I started watching WWF 2, I could actually watch both at the same time. Usually, I left WCW on the bigger screen and would watch WWF in the smaller corner, but if there was a promo going on where I wanted to hear something, I had to put that on the big screen. On the night of January 4th, though, WCW was the main attraction for me. However, the way they did that led to the beginning of the end for me as well as most other people. The very anticlimactic ending to that story, as well as the eventual fading out of NWO altogether, left a very bad taste in my mouth. With all that said, though, now I do need to back up just a little bit, because yes, I did get back to watching WWF during the Monday Night Wars, but my initial reintroduction to it was actually through the WWF Warzone video game. That same high school friend who told me all about the NWO stuff was a big Stone Cold fan, so he had to have this game, and I played it with him. At the time, the only character I really knew in it was The Undertaker, but I thought Kane looked really cool, especially once I learned he was The Undertaker's brother. The first night that I actually remember watching Raw using that picture-in-picture was right after Kane and Undertaker had both pinned Austin for the title, but that caused confusion, and they didn't know what to do with the belt after that. At first, besides The Undertaker and Kane, the only other characters I really liked were DX, because they were somewhat similar to the NWO. Of course, nowadays we all know that Triple H, X-Pac, Shawn Michaels, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash were all friends as the Clique. Of course, I thought The Undertaker was badass. His brother, Kane, was badass. The Brood was badass. All the dark characters were the ones I really liked, especially once Taker got into the point of doing the Ministry of Darkness stuff. And then, even more so, once they got combined into the corporate ministry. Clearly, in the late 90s, I had an affinity for the bad guys. When it came to SmackDown, I couldn't actually watch that show because for whatever reason, our satellite didn't have access to those channels that were necessary. So anything SmackDown related, I just had to read or watch whatever little clips they could give us on WWF.com. And I know back then, most people, including my friends, were fans of Stone Cold and The Rock, but they just weren't for me. Not at the time, anyway. When you've got characters in there who can throw lightning bolts or set the post on fire, the average Texas redneck just didn't really strike any chords with me. However, since I was buying the WCW trading cards and action figures, I did go ahead and start to get into that on the WWF side as well, starting mostly with the Titantron Live series. These figures definitely weren't as high a quality as the WCW figures were, but I had to at least get my favorites like Taker and Kane. On the video game front, THQ switched from making the WCW games to the WWF games. So now, along with WCW NWO Revenge, there was also WrestleMania 2000. So you basically had both companies with a great game using the same engine, but with a few tweaks between the two. There was also a line of WWF comic books produced by Chaos Comics that mostly focused on The Undertaker. There were some pretty cool stories that tried to explain how his powers worked and where they come from and things of that nature. Plus, it also introduced a sister for him and Kane that I kind of wish would have been done on the live show too, but you know how that goes. Lastly, the Attitude Era also saw the start of WWF annually releasing CD albums with wrestler intro themes on them. I've still got many of these in my collection right now. By the end of the 90s, WCW did try rebranding all of their shows, media, and merchandise to try and reignite a fire under the brand, but they'd already made so many mistakes on the live show that it just wasn't really helping. I was still watching, but I wasn't as engaged with it as I had become by WWF. I do remember seeing that first time Hogan started to go back from Hollywood to Hulk. I remember watching that cage match with Ric Flair, seeing him start to Hulk up for the first time in years, and be like, wait, what's going on? What's he doing? He hadn't done that in forever. The slow burn transition from Hollywood back to Hulk was probably the last good story I can remember them doing. That might just be my bias speaking because Hogan was my childhood hero kind of thing, but still. I did kind of keep up with ECW some during the height of their popularity, but not enough that I could tell you any of their storylines. Like, of course, I know some of the characters who did move on to WWE, like RVD, Tommy Dreamer, and the Dudleys, but not enough that I could tell you anything that happened during the actual ECW days. One thing I do want to briefly mention, just because I thought it was really cool at the time, during the 1998-99 TV season, WCW Nitro was followed by a Mortal Kombat TV show called Conquest. This is a live-action show meant to be set in the same universe as the movies, just as a prequel 500 years earlier. Because it was followed by Nitro, they worked hand-in-hand with each other, advertised for each other, and some wrestlers actually appeared on the show as fighters. The most notable among these was Brian Clark during his time as Wrath. He even said, "Feel my wrath," on the show. Typically, the show would give you highlight reels featuring fights from each episode leading into commercial breaks. For the episode with Wrath, they did the same thing, but each highlight featured Wrath himself, and instead of the show's theme song, actually featured Wrath's theme song. This is the one and only time where there was music featured that wasn't typically in the techno-style soundtrack. Moving on into the 2000s, all three companies were running and doing their things, WWF, WCW, and ECW, but only WWF was running with all cylinders. ECW and WCW were trying to recapture some of the earlier magic they had, but a lot of the guys were starting to move into WWF instead. My focus definitely shifted more towards WWF because of new faces, new characters, or new styles. Lita having a high-flying athletic prowess, The Undertaker becoming the American Badass, and Kane becoming more open and charismatic definitely kept my attention. In fact, this is my all-time favorite iteration of Kane, and I really wish he would have been the one to win the 2001 Royal Rumble. One thing I'll never forget, though, is the day I logged on to WWF.com and saw this picture. My mind was totally blown, and I even had to double-check that I was on the right website. I remember the night of the simulcast with WCW's last night on the air being the same night that I had a high school band concert I had to perform in. I was a drummer, so I couldn't miss it. But that meant I missed most of this night, and I was so mad. When they tried to integrate WCW into WWF programming as its own show, it didn't really work, because they didn't have most of their top guys, and people really just didn't want to see it in that form. It turned out that WWF had also quietly purchased ECW along the way, so when it came time for the invasion, they got mixed into it. Unfortunately, the whole invasion angle was very disappointing because of that lack of top stars. Later on, those stars did show up, but they didn't necessarily react in the same way that they were intended. Hogan was brought in as part of the NWO again, but everybody wanted to see him as Hulk. So when it came to Hogan versus The Rock, that match had the crowd split 50-50 the entire time. This match is still one of my favorites to go back and watch even today, just because of the energy around that match. If I did a top 10 list of WrestleMania matches, this would easily be in there somewhere. As a few more favorite faces from WCW were brought in, WWF lost a lawsuit and had to change their name to WWE, and therefore had to get the F out. During all the rebranding and restructuring, they actually did the first brand split, where they put half the roster on Raw and half on SmackDown, which was disappointing at the time because I didn't have a way to watch SmackDown. For several years, the primary way I kept up with SmackDown characters was actually through the video games. Over the years, I've pretty much played every single WWE game there's ever been on any PlayStation console. For a while, especially during the PS2 era, the video games were my primary WWE content because I was using them to potentially simulate what I thought I might be able to accomplish on my own professional wrestling journey. Off and on, for most of this decade, I either worked for or helped create various independent wrestling companies throughout South Mississippi and Alabama. Some of these companies are still running today, but I have not personally been affiliated with them myself in quite some time now. Unfortunately, I don't really have a whole lot of pictures or videos from my experiences myself, but this is actually one from my very first group that I ever worked with. Can you guess which one I am? If you'd like to, take a moment to pause the video to take a good, thorough look at the picture. After a short countdown, I will then mark the image to show you the correct answer. 3, 2, 1. Did you get it right? This picture is kind of funny to me because I'm a 5'2" guy wearing a red and black shirt and mask, standing in front of my giant tag team partner. If you've ever wondered where the name I call myself in the intros, Seville, comes from, this is it right here. When I wore a mask in wrestling, my ring name was Seville. Later on, in XAW, I unmasked and named myself Shawn Matthews because that's a reversal of my real first and middle name. Matthew Shawn, therefore became Shawn Matthews. In my last few years, I went back to being masked as Seville, but ultimately, I couldn't dedicate myself enough to the business to make it any further than I did. Granted, I did have fun while doing so, and met some big names in the process. Greg the Hammer Valentine, Virgil, Road Dogg Jesse James, and Paul Bearer, just to name a few. One thing that was kind of funny while I was working in AWF, our arena was stationed in a nightclub right outside of Mobile, Alabama. This just happened to be about 10 minutes away from where Paul Bearer lived down the street. So, on TV, he was supposed to be trapped in cement for a period of time, but in reality, he was in our audience watching our matches. Back to WWE though, even though I wasn't necessarily watching every single week during this period, I did try to at least keep up with the storylines for my favorite characters like Undertaker, Kane, the Hardys, Edge, Lita, especially when those were paired together, like the Kane and Lita story. Even though it wasn't the greatest story ever or anything like that, it was still really cool for me because that was literally my favorite male wrestler and favorite female wrestler together at the same time. I did think they kind of did Lita dirty during her retirement match with Mickie James, but since then she's popped in and out enough to kind of correct that and create a better ending, especially now that she's back in and actually a tag team champion as of this video. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Ric Flair's retirement match at WrestleMania 24 was handled really, really well. Of course, we can't talk about great WrestleMania matches without mentioning the greatest one of all time, Shawn Michaels versus The Undertaker at WrestleMania 25. The build-up, the presentation, the story they told in the ring, almost everything about that match was perfect. Another cool thing that happened during this decade was that the WB got together with UPN to create a new channel called the CW, and SmackDown carried forward onto that channel. Part of that ongoing contract was to have wrestlers appear on the CW shows, such as Smallville. They had appearances by Kane, Batista, and Ashley Mazzaro. On the downside, though, the action figures toward the end of this decade got pretty horrible, at least in my opinion. A lot of them kept using the same body sculpts over and over again, even for characters who shouldn't be anywhere close to the same size. Like the Deluxe Aggression figure series, Kane and Rey Mysterio were the exact same body shape and size. That should never happen. Moving on into the 2010s, though, by this point, I was back to being fully invested in the main product itself. Watching all the shows, ordering the WrestleManias, all that stuff. When the Nexus got started, I was 1000% on their side and supporting their goals. I remember a promo that Wade Barrett gave early on about their goals, stating that they wanted to put an end to the mistreatment and bullying of rookies in the locker room, or technically not even being let in the locker room, not being given a private space where they could change, or being forced to hide in the broom closet or something like that. It was somewhat ridiculous things, but things I could relate to due to my own experience in the independent scene and dealing with rookies being pushed to the side, basically, like we didn't belong there. Unfortunately, due to injuries and other uncontrollable circumstances, the Nexus story didn't really finish all that well, but Wade and a couple others did go on to SmackDown and form the Core. Unfortunately, the Core itself ended up not going all that well either, because by the time they got to that year's WrestleMania, they were just put into an 8-man tag match that didn't really amount to much of anything. Speaking of WrestleMania, though, this was the year that I decided I was going to be there. This is a shot from the show itself, and then this is a shot from my camera directly. Because my birthday is April 3rd, it does occasionally land on WrestleMania Day. That was the case for WrestleMania 27 in Atlanta. And let me tell you from my personal experience, there is nothing on this planet like watching The Undertaker walk down the aisle at WrestleMania. Also, for years, it was kind of surreal knowing that I happened to be able to witness Edge's final match in person before he was forced to retire. However, if you watch the product now, you know that he's been able to have successful surgery and come back being an active competitor again. Moving right along, though, seeing Kane put a mask back on, in fact, it was 2 all-new masks at the very beginning, was really awesome. The Undertaker versus Triple H Hell in a Cell End of an Era match was another one of the best of all time. CM Punk's run as WWE Champion was one of the most compelling stories they'd had in a while, especially once Paul Heyman was by his side, which led to a pretty good match with The Undertaker, capping off his undefeated streak at WrestleMania. Backing up for just a minute, I remember while I was sitting in the arena for WrestleMania 27, watching the John Cena vs. Miz match, and The Rock comes down, they have a confrontation. I was thinking, well, that's probably the end of it, just this little confrontation, and then it's over. Then the next night, I went to Raw, and they set up The Rock vs. Cena for an entire year later at the next WrestleMania. I couldn't believe it. Didn't think it was ever going to do that, because so many things can go wrong in a year. But it turned out it worked out so well that they did it twice. Once in a lifetime at WrestleMania 28 became twice in a lifetime for WrestleMania 29. By this point, I was regularly going to Raw or SmackDown shows anytime they came near my area, so when the Elimination Chamber came to New Orleans that year before WrestleMania 29, I just had to be there. Switching gears again, I got to back up just a little bit more to talk about NXT. More specifically, Triple H's reinvention of NXT. With the creation of the Performance Center and the utilization of NXT, Triple H created an all-new training ground for all up-and-coming superstars. Most of my current modern-day favorites came through the NXT system. Roman Reigns, Charlotte Flair, Seth Rollins, Becky Lynch, Bray Wyatt, Bayley. Finally, the women were starting to get equal treatment to the men. That was one thing that always bugged me in the years prior, because when I was on the independent scene, we were lucky to have one or two women per show. In fact, when I first started, we only had one. She would have matches with the rest of us, just like she was any other name on the card. It didn't matter, because she could wrestle just as well as we could. So when WWE would have a roster full of all these women, but then only a handful of them actually had any true in-ring skill, that always bugged me. Even more so when those who had the skill still weren't really showcased or allowed to present their skills. To keep this thing moving forward, though, now it's time to get into the WWE Network era. In the moment, it kind of felt like WWE was somewhat ahead of their time in doing something like this, creating an entire streaming service just for wrestling. But it was my favorite thing ever for a while. As soon as they announced it was going to include every single pay-per-view, as well as a full library for everything from the past, they had my money. There was no question about it. I spent countless hours going back to watch shows and events that I missed the first time around. The formation of the NWO, Kane's debut, those early SmackDowns that I couldn't watch because they were on UPN or some other channel. All sorts of stuff. Along with the network came a rebranding of the entire company. New logos, new title belts to reflect those logos, entrance stages, everything. It wouldn't take long for them to go back to a true brand split where Raw and SmackDown each had their own rosters and their own championships. Just to note a couple of my favorite stories from around this time. Gotta have Kane in one of them. I thought it was really cool when he did the Corporate Kane / Demon Kane thing where he would change from one to the other, especially in the episodes where they would literally have him morph from one to the other in the same sequence. Then, because I was a big fan of Arrow at the time, I thought it was really cool to see Stephen Amell come in and do his thing against Stardust. They did the smart thing and turned it into a tag match so that he wasn't in the ring the entire time by himself. But in the end, he showed up and showed out and proved to be one of the best celebrity guests up to that point. Later on, something I never thought I'd see happen in WWE was Sting. Now, in hindsight, his run there wasn't really that great, but it was still cool to see, at least in his feud with Triple H. Especially once it got to Mania, they turned it into a DX versus NWO thing, kind of rekindling the WCW versus WWF thing, which could have been better, I ain't gonna lie, but it made me wish I could have seen that happen while they were all in their primes. And finally, another match that I say is cool just because of what it was. Did it have the best ending? No. But just the mere fact that women main evented WrestleMania was a huge deal. Just a couple other things I want to note before finishing up this section. The games have been taken over by 2K, still in partnership with Ukes, but now with 2K's money. That helped them improve the game more and more each year, making a great product, especially in 2K19. Also, Mattel took over the action figure license, which made them better than they had ever been up to that point. There was two different lines, the Basics and the Elites. Basics were mostly for kids, and the Elites were intended for the adult collectors. Since then, they've also added in the Ultimate Edition line, which has a bit more of a premium collectability feel to them, with better sculpts and more accessories per package. Getting into the 2020s, however, as we all know, the whole world went through a change, not just WWE or wrestling in general. During the pandemic era, a lot of newer talents became champions as well as faces of the company. Oddly enough, it provided a chance for those who would typically be lower on the cards a chance to step up and show what they could really do. WWE being forced to film inside the Performance Center with no audience certainly led to a lot of challenging issues for the company, but also led to some new creative ideas, such as these cinematic matches like The Undertaker versus AJ Styles in the Boneyard match. While I'll be the first to admit that it wasn't really ideal for The Undertaker's final match to not be in front of a crowd, I do still think it was a fitting end for the character itself. Later on, as they progressed into the Thunderdome, it did start to get a little bit more familiarity back with the presentation and things, but having the audience on the screen still wasn't quite the same as having a live crowd. However, they got better at creating stories around the fact that they weren't in front of a live crowd. Being crowdless for well over a year, with the exception of that following WrestleMania, having to adjust to all new concepts and ideas, as well as most of my favorites retiring, going to the Hall of Fame, or all of the above, definitely showed to me that this was an all new era for WWE. Right at the beginning of the pandemic, just before that year's WrestleMania, SmackDown was supposed to be in New Orleans. I fully intended to go to that show. Then, of course, it got canceled along with every other major sporting event. In that moment, I thought to myself, well, whenever I get to go to a WWE show again, the world will feel a little more normal again. I didn't know it was going to take a year and a half for that, but it did. Finally, last year, SmackDown came back to New Orleans. I sat in that crowd, cheered the Bloodline, cheered Charlotte Flair. Finally, things felt like they were getting back to where they needed to be. Along with the live events, also returned to conventions, allowing me the chance to meet a lot of my favorites as they toured around the area. Over the years, whether I got to take pictures with them or not, I have been able to collect autographs from many of my favorites, and I hope to continue to do so. Those of you who have followed my channel for a while and or seen my action figure collection videos, you know that wrestling is the single biggest category in my entire collection. It's always growing, it's always changing. I'm always on the lookout for the newest, best version of each character that I like, especially the Ultimate Edition figures. So with all that said, I am super excited for this year's WrestleMania. There's a lot of really great matches on the card, especially anything involving the Bloodline, Charlotte Flair, Cody Rhodes, Rhea Ripley, and of course the return of Lita. Now that you know most of my favorites, tell me some of yours. What match are you looking forward to most? Or, if you happen to be watching this after WrestleMania has aired, what was your favorite match, or what was your favorite moment of WrestleMania 39? Let me know in the comments below.